Thanks very much, and thanks for the invitation to come along this evening. And thanks to the previous speakers, particularly David, for stepping in at short notice. I just want to clarify one thing about the term green Lairds. I think it was first coined by Peter Peacock, who used to be convener of Highland Council. He was an MSP, education minister, and he wrote an article, I think in the Press and Journal, in the lead up to the 2021 Holyrood election. I think that was the first use of the term. And it's been quickly picked up as a shorthand for actually all sorts of stuff. Different people mean different things by it, and I'll have a wee look at that a little bit later. I just also want to pick up what Sarah mentioned. The Scottish Land Commission has been doing quite a bit of work on this, and if you're interested in some of the kind of more technical stuff, I would recommend you read some of the reports they've commissioned on the Scottish Land Commission website, because it is clear that the investors coming into the so-called carbon market have been responsible in the last 2-3 years for driving up land values. That's fairly clear. I should say this is nothing new, and I'll return to that. I also want to say that net zero, in my view, is a very, very tricky concept. I think we should query it far more. Net zero at what level? Actually, I think we should be going beyond net zero. We need global cooling. And so one of the problems with the term net zero is that it has encouraged corporations globally to, rather than reduce emissions, see what they can do that is cheaper, and they have alighted upon offsetting. And the concept of net zero has facilitated that. So I want to talk briefly this evening about the current trend and just make a few observations. But first of all, I want to kind of say 3 kind of preliminary things. I mean, first, I am not a fan of offsetting. I would go so far as to say I think it should be banned. It's an unregulated scam, in my view, because 1 tonne of carbon sequestration potential in Scotland is lost every time that tonne is offset. Now, supporters will argue that these projects are additional. They wouldn't happen without investment. But that doesn't negate the criticism that offsetting reduces the potential of land-based carbon projects. Because, as I think we're all aware, the answer to the climate crisis is to reduce emissions and to increase the sequestration potential of land, of forests, of soils, of peatlands and wetland. So, for example, a cement factory that emits, let's say, 1,000 tonnes of greenhouse gases, it can, at the moment, offset them through buying carbon credits obtained from a tree planting project in Aberdeenshire. Now, the net impact of that on the climate is in theory 0 if that tree planting project wasn't going to go ahead anyway. Alternatively, if the cement factory reduces its emissions by 50% and the tree planting project proceeds because it's a good thing anyway, then the impact on the climate will be 150% reduction in net emissions. And that's why this kind of rush to offsetting occupies a kind of middle ground of where we need to be, which is actually greenhouse gas reductions. And this is an unregulated market, and therefore it's not being undertaken in a strategic, planned way. It's a bit like the Wild West. Second, and I've touched on this already, this debate I think is a symptom of a much bigger debate about land and its ownership and use, because the current spikes in land values is nothing new. It's happened before, and it'll happen again. It's happened when onshore wind became fairly profitable. It was a massive spike. People said, you know, I own all this land, but it's worth very little. It's just windswept hillsides. Well, as soon as you could put a wind turbine on that and make a lot of money, that windswept hillside became very, very profitable, and land prices spiked. So the whole history of land is a history of boom and bust, really. And it'll happen again unless we implement a radical programme of land reform, democratising land. The third observation I want to make as a preliminary is about the term green Lairds, and I think this term is problematic because it conflates 2 things, 2 very different things. It conflates green, which is generally conceived of as a good thing, and Lairds, which is an old Scots term, but is generally used as a pejorative term. And actually there are quite a lot of people who fall under this description. There are the rewilders like Mr. Anders Paulsen, who owns Wildland Limited, a Danish billionaire who's bought up land in Scotland, starting with the Glenfeshie estate in the Cairngorms. I was very active in the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. We used the Glenfeshie estate as an example of the hypocrisy of northern governments who were heading off to Rio de Janeiro to persuade southern governments like Brazil to stop deforestation, and yet were presiding over large-scale deforestation, ongoing deforestation and land degradation in places like Glenfeshie. Now, Anders Paulsen's turned that around. He didn't buy Glenfeshie because he wanted carbon credits, but he is a green laird, according to some. Charities such as Trees for Life, who've been doing long-term tree planting and natural regeneration projects in Glen Affric, have bought the Dundregan estate, are doing a huge native woodland restoration project there. They're green lairds. Because they're a charity, are they good? We have existing landowners who want to diversify their enterprises into these carbon markets and see a potential source, another source of income. They're green lairds. And then we have the institutional investors, like Standard Life, like the people who just bought Glendy, who hope that over time there will be a growing market for carbon credits and indeed want them themselves either to sell or to offset their own emissions. So actually, under this rubric, there's a lot of different people with a lot of different motives, and I think it's wrong to kind of class them all as one homogenous group of people with a uniform set of motives seeking to do a uniform set of things. So those are sort of three sort of preliminaries. Now, I actually welcome people investing in land. When I say investing, I mean actually investing. It's often said that people buying land in Scotland are investing in Scotland. They're not actually. Well, they might be, but at the point of buying land, all they're doing is paying a sum of money to the previous owner. So a transaction takes place. They haven't done any investment yet. They've just paid for something. But I'm very much in favour of private investment in land. I'm very much in favour of private investment in nature. What I don't welcome is land speculation, and Scotland's been rife for land speculation over decades because we have a very, very unregulated land market. And also it's worth observing, of course, as well, that the carbon market in some guise has been around for some time. There are carbon emission trading schemes across Europe, and it will be necessary, in fact it is necessary, to have some kind of market mechanism globally around carbon. Some kind, but it has to be agreed globally. In fact, I think one of the outcomes of COP26 was to try and bring more regulation to the whole question of carbon offsetting and carbon markets. But as I said earlier, this market is completely unregulated, and if Scotland does want to become a net zero nation, does want to maximise the potential of its natural resources to sequester carbon, it seems to me that you should be limiting the amount of greenhouse gases you're sequestering in wetlands and woodlands and peatlands, limiting the amount that you allow people to offset their emissions, because that is basically reducing our potential and in turn the global potential of sequestration, which is really, really important. And it's also worth noting as well that sequestration through natural ecosystems is overrated as a means of tackling the climate crisis. There was a study done by the London School of Economics that showed that even if you maximise the sequestration potential of every square inch of the planet, the seas and the land, that means no room for people to live, no room for food growing, okay? So a ridiculous scenario, but if you did that, you would merely be capturing 10 years worth of global emissions. That's all you'd be doing. So the huge priority here is to reduce emissions. That's the massive priority. And there are dozens of other reasons why we should be restoring peatlands and wetlands and woodlands, right? Biodiversity, not least of them. Soil conservation, water, recreation, etc. But, as I said earlier, and as has been identified by the Scottish Land Commission Research, this is having an impact on land markets, on land values in Scotland, and the question is what to do about all of this. So as I said in my opening, my preference is to, by default, outlaw this, but at the very least make it subject to a licensing scheme. because, as I say, the priorities are to reduce emissions and to restore nature. And the more you tie those two together, where one offsets the other, the less ability you have to tackle the climate crisis. Now, there's all sorts of ways in which we can restore wetlands and woodlands and peatlands without recourse to people who want to make a speculative gain from that. We could make it a legal responsibility in the tenure system. So if you own land, you are legally obliged to restore nature to a certain degree. We could do it through increasing regulation of existing land uses. I mean, forestry and agriculture are not part of the planning system. We could, in theory, bring them into the planning system. We could ensure the restoration of nature through cross-compliance and government subsidies. So whenever we give any permissions, consents, grants, subsidies to people who exercise control over nature, we should make it a condition that they restore woodlands and wetlands and peatlands, etc. We can do it through direct interventions by the state. The state can acquire land and do this. We can do it through supporting the work of existing non-governmental environmental organisations like the John Muir Trust and the Royal Society for Protection of Birds and Trees for Life and others. We can do it through financial incentives. We can do it through the tax system. There's any number of ways we can restore nature in Scotland through policy and regulation and statute without having to resort to the global carbon market. Because restoring nature is a key public policy goal, and with the right framework, we can restore nature. But as things stand, this is not happening. So I've got kind of 3 suggestions, short, medium, and long, and they're just kind of examples. I mean, first of all, short term, I think we need to take the heat out of land markets, and the best way to take the heat out of land market is through the tax system. So currently, land that is used for offsetting pays no rates. So you and I all pay council tax, used to be domestic rates, and people who occupy non-domestic property pay non-domestic rates, except forestry and agriculture, who've been exempt from this for 150 years. And it's kind of ridiculous, like this building we're in, or this room, or this suite, Aberdeen Mental Health Charity, they're currently on the valuation roll in Grampian at £21,000, so they're paying rates, in theory, of about 50% is the current poundage, of about £10,500. Now actually they're not paying it because they're a charity and they get 100% relief. But in contrast, upland farms and estates that are worth millions are paying absolutely nothing. In fact, the bizarre thing in all of this is that I did a study years ago about land taxes and discovered that Denmark has about 3 or 4 different kinds of land taxes that Danish citizens pay if they own property. And they also pay it on property they own outside Denmark. So I'm sure that Mr. Paulson, the Danish billionaire who now owns a lot of land in Scotland, I'm sure he's obeying the law. I'm sure he's paying his Grund tax. The irony is he's probably the only Scottish landowner, other than other Danes, who are paying a Grund tax, and he's not paying it to Highland Council or to Perth and Ross Council. He's paying it to his home municipality in Esbjerg. And that just kind of highlights the ridiculous thing about this. We could increase land and building transaction taxes, for example. So the tax system is a key way of moderating and taking the heat out of land markets. And that can be done in relatively quick order. In the medium term, we need to regulate carbon markets. We regulate many, many markets. There's currently obviously a cost of living crisis and an energy crisis, and we're discovering that the way that Ofgem regulates energy markets is not really being done in the interest of the consumer. It's more being done in the interest of preserving the profits of the electricity companies. But we regulate a lot of markets. We should regulate this market. And in my view, the most effective way to do that is to make the atmosphere a commons. So the high seas is a commons regime. No one owns the high seas. It's a commons regime. But currently, if you own land in Scotland, you own not just the surface. If you own a square hectare of land, you own from the centre of the earth to the heavens above. You own a pyramid. Okay? And so you own the atmosphere. Now, there's been a host of regulations. Civil Aviation Acts are the most obvious one. When civil aviation started, if you want to fly a plane from London to Edinburgh, you had to ask the permission of every landowner because they owned the airspace. So clearly that wasn't really practical, so they passed an act to say that wasn't required. But if we make the atmosphere above a useful height, which is all you can reasonably make use of up there, so you may want to extend your building by a few stories, so that's 10 or 20 metres. You may have tall trees, so that's another few metres. But beyond about 100 metres, you have no useful use for your atmospheric estate. So turn it into a commons. And that then means that you can have a governance regime for that commons that's regulating the inputs and outputs. Okay? These things are not complicated. They work in other parts of the world. So medium term, I think that's the best way of doing this. And whether the facility for international capital to continue buying carbon credits and all the rest of it exists in Scotland, that would be up for Parliament to decide. Longer term, and concluding on this point, although I've got one or two concluding thoughts, we need fundamental land reform because all these pressures are arising because of the lack of regulation in our land market. It's a very laissez-faire land market. Anyone from anywhere in the world can buy as much land as they can get their hands on in Scotland. So that decisions about the ownership and use of land are subject to greater democratic oversight. Power over land is more redistributed. And all public policy on tax, on planning, on the environment, on housing, on transport is geared towards restoring nature and managing land for the public interest. But Scotland doesn't even have an effective land use policy. We don't even have a comprehensive land information system. If you try and find out who are these green lairds, you won't be able to find out. So we need far, far greater transparency in Scotland's land and information about it. So to conclude, as I said earlier, we need private investment in nature. I have no problem with that whatsoever. And that private investment is available. Mr. Paulson didn't require, £18 per tonne carbon payments to do what he did. He did it for other reasons. Not entirely clear because he never really gives media interviews, but he clearly loves nature and has a passion and wanted to invest in it. And there's actually a lot of people like that. Okay? So we're not short of private investment. We need to make sure we get the right kind of private investment. But the Scottish Government has a target of doubling the carbon market by 2025, and yet it's not said why it wants to do that and how the market should operate. My best interpretation of that is they want to double any market or triple any market that is bringing money to Scotland. They see that as an end in itself. And I think that's fairly poor. So the current concerns around green lairds, I think, is a direct consequence of our laissez-faire land market and an unregulated carbon market. And I think both should be regulated. So finally, what can you do? I was asked to sort of make some comment about what people can do. First of all, if you're interested in this, look at the documents on the Scottish Land Commission website. They're a bit heavy going, they're quite detailed, but they're good pieces of work there. And secondly, and this is more kind of relevant to your day-to-day lives, is when you buy a cup of coffee or a bottle of wine or energy or any services, any consumer goods and services, increasingly companies are making claims about net zero, about carbon neutrality and carbon offsetting. Just look at the side of any packet of anything these days, and increasingly it's appearing. Contact them. Ask them to back up their claims. What are they actually doing to get to net zero, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? If they're claiming offsetting, where are they offsetting? How can they verify that? Because there's an awful lot of misleading claims being made by private business because it sees this as an excellent... I was in a restaurant the other day and bought a bottle of wine, and not prominently on the label was net zero wine. Well, what does that mean? But increasingly, they see consumers as exercising choices in relationship to consumer products and exercising those choices in a way that wants to help solve the climate crisis. So stick a badge on thing, or say you're going to plant a tree, and sales go up. So interrogate them. Thanks very much.
Thanks, and we can stop recording.